I'll call to order the meeting of the Wenham Finance and Advisory Committee on Wednesday, December 20th at 6:33 p.m. Present are Jeff Calder.
Finn Sprague.
And Dave Harnish. Great. Thanks, guys. So I thought, and you guys sounds like are both traveling, so might be a little hard for you guys to follow through, or follow along. But given that Jeff Soulard had sent out an email to us all a little earlier this week that showed us or provided to us what was the certified Department of Revenue certified tax rate for FY24, that he just spent a couple of minutes walking us through what the process is of how that figure is calculated and how it becomes certified, and then a email they sent out just a short while ago also helps make the link between the FY24 tax levy, which is what you see in the budget book, one of the first pages in that budget summary that was provided last week, and what the request is for FY25. So with that, I will let
Jeff do his best to help us understand.
Mute yours. Okay. So I think most of you are traveling, so you wouldn't have the what I just sent recently. But essentially, you also are earlier that we are, the tax rates just dropped from 1755 or 1735 down to 1566. And the real driver for that is we continue to, with the help of the building department and the assessors department, we continue to increase the assessed values in town in two ways. One, we capture improvements that have been made in the past year, and probably in many cases in more than the past year, that maybe just have kind of not been captured over the years before we had sort of a full-time building and full-time assessing department. So this year we captured what equates to $310,000, excuse me, of what we call new growth. And essentially how new growth is calculated is there's new assessments found for folks improving their kitchen, building a great room, adding a second story, whatever it might be. The assessors go out and they capture that at a valuation, and new growth is then captured by multiplying that valuation by the prior year tax rate. And the DOR looks at that as, that's, had that been captured correctly in the prior year, you would have had that much added to your Proposition 2.5 levy limit. So what happens is you start with a base from the prior year. When we set the tax rate, as we just did last week or earlier this week, the state gives us our Proposition 2.5 levy limit, which at the end of last year was a little over 19.3 million. Then we get, as you would expect, the 2.5% growth on that. That's Prop 2.5, right? So that gives us 483,000, new tax dollars we can spend without going over the levy limit. Then we actually get to incorporate this $310,000 of new growth that was captured by the building and assessing departments. So the net effect of that is that we go from about $19.3 million of valuation to just over $20.1 million of valuation. And then that becomes our Prop 2.5 levy limit for the year. And the final variable in this piece is, you've probably heard the term exempt debt thrown around. Wenham does not have a large amount of exempt debt compared to some other communities around, and that's really just a function of where you are in sort of the building cycle, whether it's, building public safety buildings or town halls or schools or what have you. Right now, we're not carrying a lot of debt for that. But when we do vote for projects that we know we can't carry the debt service underneath the normal Proposition 2.5 levy limit, we vote as a town to exempt those from Proposition 2.5. And then whatever that debt is basically outside the levy limit I was just talking about. So it can be extra taxation that's over and above the 20.1 million I was just talking about. So for this particular year, the debt service that is exempt is roughly $465,000. So what that does ultimately for FY24, the year that we're in, is it brings us from the 20.1 million up to nearly 20.6 million. And then that becomes what we can actually levy for tax this year. And when you have a chance to, get somewhere where you can take a look at this, you'll see the attachment I sent today. In the top part, I walked through this part I'm just talking about now. And in the bottom part, we then translate that into the actual setting of the FY24 tax rate, which is really fairly simple. This is, it compiles a bunch of other schedules we file with the DOR, but essentially you walk through how much are we spending as a town, which is about $27 million. How much do we expect to raise elsewhere in terms of local receipts, motor vehicle excise, rent from the iron rail, fees, permits, whatever we might do to raise revenue? That's about $6.5 million. So that gets us down to 20.56 million that we need to raise by taxation, which is, a hair under it's about $26,000 under what our levy limit is for this particular year, including the exempt debt. So then you take that and you essentially divide what you need to spend, what your tax levy is, by the assessed value for the property, which in this case is $1.3 billion. Is that right? Million. Yeah, $1.3 billion. And that brings you down to this mill rate of 15.66 for the year. I feel like this probably gets lost a little translation as folks are driving up and down Route 95. But I'm happy to speak to folks, sort of in more detail.
Described it in emails.
Yeah, and I think the email kind of will walk you through it as well.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, one question. This is Dave. So basically, you net back a credit on the excluded debt, right? It basically gets eliminated from your tax levy or added back the way you guys are showing it, right?
I think I heard you say the debt would be added back.
Yeah.
You were really faint.
Or it gets basically subtracted, right, from the levy, right, is the excluded debt. So whatever debt service related to any sort of public finance gets removed from
it actually goes
your tax levy.
The other way. It actually gets added. So the Proposition 2.5 levy limit is calculated independently. And then the exempt debt is actually on top of that. So it allows you to take more. But as you pay off the debt service, that does at the end of the day, and maybe this is what you're saying, David, is when the debt service is paid off, that is no longer allowed as part of your levy limit in future years. So it's one of the reasons that debt exclusion or capital exclusion overrides are much more preferable than operating budget overrides, because operating overrides are essentially forever. If you say our budget has gone up $200,000 and we need an override, that becomes your new base forever. When you use either a capital exclusion or a debt exclusion, it is a side calculation that increases your total levy limit for the year, but only temporarily until that debt or capital project is completed.
So it's additive.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the funds to cover the debt service have to be collected.
Correct.
Through taxes. So it's additive to
Yes, it's additive to the main calculation. But then it gets taken off as the debt, when the debt is paid off.
And as you mentioned,
And Jeff,
it's not part of the same calculation
what-
because it doesn't go up by 2.5%.
Exactly. It actually, in theory, it can, your excluded debt can actually go up much more than that. As I was saying to Jeff when he came in, if you think of a project, a $10 million project, and in the year you authorize it, you might only take out $2 million of debt. So in that first year, your debt service is fairly small. But by the end of the first year, halfway into the second year, the project is complete, and you bond the entire amount, and your debt service might double or triple in year 2 or in year 3, just based on where you are in the process of actually finalizing your debt. So it's not uncommon. Once again, to use Essex as an example, you're building a couple of different schools, or you have a couple of school projects that are in the mix, and one of them is older and fully bonded, and the other one is a work in process, and you're taking bands, and the project is the debt is kind of moving all over the place. You can have a situation where the debt goes up one year, comes down the next year, depending on when you finalize debt, at what rate you finalize it at, and things like that. But the key is that the exemption is completely tied to whatever the debt service is on whatever the town authorized. So on something like the fields, our share will probably be something in the range of 5 million, I would gather. So whatever happens with that, if we do a short-term ban for a few years and we pay a really low interest rate, whatever that interest only loan is, that's our exemption. The next year we bond it and it amortizes at a 4.5% rate. The payments go way up, and that amount of debt service is what is allowed to be added to our tax levy until it is paid off.
got it. And Jeff, we don't know what the other towns they're all filing as well, or I don't know if they've published yet. Will this put Wenham more in line with our either similar sized peers on the North Shore, or put us in a more middle range than sort of pushing the 19-20 range?
I would say it's more middle range. Just by comparison, we set the Essex tax rate the same day. Essex came in at 1332. Essex is smaller, which intuitively should almost mean that Essex is slightly higher than Wenham, just because we have a smaller denominator, a smaller tax base. But you're getting much more normalized. I would say I don't know Hamilton's off the top of my head, but as I recall, Wenham was usually a little higher than Hamilton, but within striking distance. But yeah, I would say this is getting you closer to right sized. I would like to think, we could get closer to the high 14s or something like that. But, it's always tough because you have all kinds, just talking to Steve today, you've always got all kinds of, capital projects and different things that, are going to move the needle. And I think the one thing I would say is I think a lot of hard work has been done in the building departments and the assessing departments to, they're the big driver in how we've closed this gap. They have right sized the denominator, which has brought the tax rate itself down. But I think, the proverbial low hanging fruit has been achieved now. So I don't think you're going to see any huge strides on changing that denominator dramatically moving forward, at least in the next couple of years.
Makes sense. Yep, got it.
Yeah, it would seem not, given the effort that the assessor's department has gone through in order to better.
And talking to, I ran into the building inspector today, and he mentioned that, I think this year the new growth was about 310. Last year it might have been about 350 or 360. He mentioned that I think Maplewood, and maybe it was the old Flynn's golf course was the other one that was a big project a year or two ago. Those drove huge numbers on new growth. I don't think there's any other big projects in the pipeline. So that, between, I think they've caught a lot of the small stuff, and then we don't have any other big things in the pipeline. So I think they all feel like it's kind of normalized from here on out.
So I was having conversations with neighbors about this, and I think the thing that people are not aware of is how their own individual assessment changes year to year, and how that may not mean they get the exact same increase or decrease to their own property taxes this year. I think as I looked around my neighborhood from 22 to 23, there was what appeared to be basically a 30 to 40% increase in property valuations from the assessors. But this year, as I look from 23 to 24, it's pretty flat, maybe a 5% or so increase. There was, I think as we think about how to explain this to the citizens, right? I wish there was an easy way to do that. Really, yes, your assessment went up 5% this year, but everyone else's, the total value of the town went up 10. So your property tax is actually going to shrink by 5, because you have a smaller percentage of the total pie. Like that island metaphor that was made earlier.
So I think in the email I sent out to you folks earlier in the week, I didn't include the actual spreadsheet, but there's a little table in there that I gave you that sort of showed the example of like the $800,000 house or whatever. I don't know how comfortable Steve would be. I can ask him if we could, put something like that out there. I had a similar tool in Essex that I would work with residents. If they came in, I could kind of show them in real time. But there is somewhat of a, people get a little leery of, putting a spreadsheet tool out there that people can manipulate. But, we can show people if we have the last 2 tax bills, the tax bill they're going to receive in a couple of weeks, either the value that's on there, which I think you can probably look up through the, on the assessor's website or whatever at this point. But, there is a tool available, and maybe it's something where, we distribute it to the FinCom members and maybe, Board of Selectmen and things like that too. And they could have discussions with not necessarily hand the tool out, but they could certainly have discussions with other residents they know to sort of say, if this is your value in 23 and this is your value in 24, here's your tax change.
Yeah, I would agree that putting out a spreadsheet probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but just a couple of those slides, I think, could be useful in allowing someone to connect the dots between change in tax or change in assessment and change in tax rate need to go hand in hand in order to figure out what your actual change in tax is. And if people get overly excited about the change in assessment without knowing how the tax rate works in conjunction with it, they're going to draw the wrong conclusion. And then, as I was mentioning, get on social media, start getting other people kind of riled up, which is not productive for anybody.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Well, because, like I think I said, like, intuitively people think the rate went down. Woohoo, my taxes are going down. And that's like, well, no, you may or may not be going down. You may be subsidizing other people's tax reduction, or you may be, it's taking somebody else's, tailwind to reduce your own. I do think one of the things, I know we talked about this ClearGov budgeting software, and one of the offshoots of that, I think, is I believe it has a component that does this, but it's not a spreadsheet. It's a software tool that is an app, on a website that is locked down. So, I think it has put in your tax bill or put in your assessed value from 23, put it in from 24, and it will show you the change, but you don't have any chance to manipulate it.
Sure, but to me, just using median numbers, an average house value, and then people can see directionally what's happening here. But I don't know, that's kind of.
I think the trouble is that when you're in a sort of
administrator, assessor's department,
when the assessors are in a process of kind of right sizing the whole town, the median. If you have a median house, it doesn't necessarily mean your you know, we know what the median is in 23, we know what it is in 24, but the particular houses can have very different experiences. I mean, you could have an 800, let's call the median 800,000. You could have an $800,000 house that was way undervalued. So you went from 800 to $1 million, and you could have someone who was right-sized already. So they kind of stayed flat. So it's, I mean, I think it's, the assessors are better equipped to make these calls.
Yes, yes, but just dropping the new assessed value before the rate just seems to get people distressed.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately mechanically, you know, you're always up against it to set the tax rate, so it's tough to have too much lead time, I think, for the assessors to get the data out there too far in advance. But you know, I think, you know, honestly, we pay some, you know, a decent amount now for shared services, and we've beefed up the assessor department. You know, it's worth having those discussions with them on what can we
How do we
do.
improve communication?
Yeah, and it was a reval year, which is a bigger. Yeah, it was a bigger year for them this year. Next year it should be an easier year, so it could be that next year, you know, maybe the select board puts more pressure on them to, you know, work on communication a little bit more upfront.
Right.
Yeah, I think that this is a challenge that the select board made, right, at our last meeting, was that how they thought that the communication was something that they really wanted to put a priority on this year. And as I think about this is going to be one of those really sensitive areas. Communication doesn't have to be complicated, but sort of, you know, so like the data that we had gotten before, how, you know, overall, you know, all the value in Wenham went up by about 10%, I think was the number that sticks out in my mind. Like the denominator, right? Total value of all property went up by 10%. So that's really what drives the reduction in the mill rate, right? So that figuring out exactly how to do that, I don't like, I keep saying I don't want to reinvent the wheel here. The communication of how mill rates work and how a reval works, it's something that, you know, all towns have had to do for, you know, 100, 200 years. So exactly what format that's, I'm not sure, but it couldn't hurt to find something for our own situation into that format. I can't hear anybody. Is it mute?
Sorry, guys. Yeah, we keep trading off who mutes and who doesn't mute because of the echo. But yeah, fair point, Finn. That I think that some information in where there currently is a bit of a vacuum of one, other than the new assessments dropping and getting people kind of anxious about what might happen to their taxes, would be better, and we can continue to advocate for that, though I don't think we can do it ourselves directly. But yeah, good point, and I think it would certainly head off some questions and some concerns that people have.
And maybe this is a question for both Jeffs. Could it be as simple as having someone at the town meeting, the assessor, getting up and talking big picture, walk through a couple slides? This is how the process works, just a refresher on how mill rates and taxes are done. It might be too much of a rabbit hole, but I didn't know if that would be an appropriate forum to sort of walk through it.
David, I would say probably town meeting is probably not the forum for that. That's a complicated enough day. I would say that really we would be looking at, you know, ideally it would be something around this time of year when the rate's set, but I think that's very difficult. But I would suggest that maybe we could ask the assessors to work with Jim over at the Council on Aging as a place where we could do, one or two presentations over there from the assessor's office. I know they already go over there and do a nice job of working with people on exemptions and things like that, making sure that seniors and veterans are getting, the proper exemptions that they're entitled to and things like that. So, maybe it is a question of once or twice a year outside of town meeting, to do that type of presentation, that would be helpful. But I think, I assume Wenham is no different than Essex, and town meeting is stressful and confusing enough without, add that into the mix.
Yep, no, that's why I was asking. Yep, thanks.
Yeah, I like that suggestion though of a presentation of Council on Aging.
Yeah,
It would have a broader appeal, of course, than just seniors, but they have I think a pattern of introducing or inviting in speakers to address their group. So
right.
Why not?
Yeah, I mean, something we did in Essex, I don't know, probably 10 years ago when I was on the finance committee, we didn't do it for too many years, but we did actually do almost like neighborhood meetings for a while. So when we had some really big ticket items, we were going to be looking at building a school, some other things, it was sort of like a finance committee person and a select board person, that we would find, someone in a neighborhood. And, so say Finn has, either he wanted to host it or he has a friend who might be willing to host it. And, one select board member, one finance committee member, and I could certainly join in something like this if there was a desire for that. But you kind of go and you just have this little round table, with whatever, 10, 15 people. I think I had probably 25 or 30 at one of them I did. Folks found it really, really helpful because we were there to talk about one or two things, and it really evolved into discussions about a bunch of different things that people found really helpful. And I found, honestly, that was one of the most helpful things we ever did. I mean, we heard talk on Saturday of, putting stuff on the websites and whatever. And, I know internally whether it was on the finance committee or as an actual working member of town hall, you can do all kinds of work and create all kinds of worksheets and different things you can put on the website to inform people. But the reality is you get fairly low traffic, to those, as we mentioned Saturday, social media sites tend to have better traffic, but the town, generally speaking, tries to avoid doing business on social media. But I don't know if anybody has any appetite for that, but I will say, I really thought of all the things I ever did on the finance committee in 9 years, those kind of neighborhood meetings were some of the best things we did. And it really got us to reach, unless, I don't know all you folks, but, I'm assuming you don't all live on the same street or whatever, but between the select board and the FinCom, hopefully you represent enough neighborhoods that you could, hit a broad cross section of town. It doesn't always have to be the same people, it could be Jeff and, Diane doing one, and it could be, David and Deirdre doing one, or something like that. But I found those really helpful.
I'm just curious.
I like.
Yeah, you could start those meetings with an agenda in mind, but given that it's an open forum, did they ever get away from you and just
They never really did.
evolve off into something that
they definitely went off like sort of your agenda, but they never, you have to obviously work to make sure, that it doesn't turn into somebody's, pet peeve or pet project or something where you're into the minutia of, why does I think my neighbor should pay more excise tax or something. But we always seem to keep them sort of on point. And I think between, the key to having sort of a select board member and a finance member there, is like, I was a fairly informed finance committee member, but there's plenty of things that cross, the desk of the selectmen that are non-financial, that if I was there alone as a finance committee member, it would have been very difficult to cover the breadth of topics that came up. But with a select board member there, I would say even though it went far, off the agenda we had started with, we were able to stay on top of it. And I actually thought that was one of the more helpful parts of it, because we talk about this a lot, right? Like sort of marketing what it is the town does and whatever. And, I think what came out of it for a lot of folks, that, maybe folks I didn't know, or whatever, was, they kind of came away with, a bit of a sense of security of, everybody kind of like, maligns government or whatever. And it's like, oh, I got a bunch of hacks. They don't know what they're doing. And, I think there was something kind of, gave people a sense of security that, you had a couple of professional people there, sort of articulating the problems of the town and the challenges and how we were attacking them. And I think people left with a good sense of, kind of the chatter I hear on social media that, nobody knows what they're doing. That doesn't reconcile with what I just heard from, from Jeff and Diane when they just covered, 12 or 15 different points about the town.
Yeah, interesting
And
thought.
you can always say no. I mean, you can always say like, that's a bit much for this
Topic,
topic,
sure.
or,
Yeah, yeah.
certainly come to a select board meeting and talk about that further or something like that.
Definitely, I think worth more thought on our part about whether that's something that we could pull off.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a question of what the format is of the conversation. You've got the very broad meeting, the town meeting, where you've got hundreds of people and a lot to cover. You've got small group meetings, right, in the format there. And then the thing that I'm trying to figure out is what I might call an elevator pitch or a one pager on what's going on, right? And the narrative that I'm trying to put in my head is got to be a narrative that I can explain to anybody that comes up to me about, how, what are we voting on? What are you talking about numerators and denominators and mill rates? What am I going to be able to express in 30 seconds to a minute of monologuing to get them to understand what's going on this coming year? That I'm trying to put together in my head.
Yeah, right, for sure. That is always a challenge, to be more succinct and try to get across enough information for people to understand without providing too much information, which will allow them to kind of lose the point or not grasp the point that you're trying to get across. So I think it's worth us giving some thought to. Maybe not in the midst of the budget cycle, but we will look at the calendar a little later to see how the deliverables that we have line up with folks' availability and the calendar and when annual meeting is in April.
Yeah, I mean, you do have a nice sweet spot between sort of end of February, early March, when you need to get the deliverables done to the actual meeting date in April. And I think people will receive the booklet sometime around between the 15th and 22nd of March, based on the schedule we've laid out. So it does leave you some time where your work is done in terms of the budget, and you could have just a finance committee meeting that you really market and put out on Zoom and say, we've come up with our, kind of elevator pitch, as Finn says. And we're really going to lay that out to folks, in a big finance committee meeting, in between when the budget booklet ships and when you actually come to town meeting.
Yeah, good thought. So shifting gears a bit, wanted to use this meeting as well as kind of a regroup after the Saturday meeting with all the departmental heads and town administrator and finance manager as well, delivering their current state of the budget. Purpose being just to get your all general thoughts on the information received, what additional information would be useful as we start to move along the path of being able to sometime starting in January, I think I have it on my calendar, start having more direct conversations about the budget and our recommendations vote, which we need to provide for the warrant book. So let me just kind of open it up to Dave and to Finn. Get your thoughts on what might where there might be some gaps. I think there is an expectation that this was not a one-time opportunity for us to meet with these folks, that really more complicated and there is information I'd like to get into a little more specifically that they would be available.
Sure, I can start. Yep, I can start if you can hear me okay.
Yes.
I would say the meeting was very well organized. I have a small sample set of one, but I thought, Steve and Jeff did a great job sort of managing and orchestrating and explaining, and then each of the departments was able to, pretty clearly articulate the changes. I think what jumped out to me is that the transformation and sort of like repopulation of vacancy that has gone on through the pandemic, the town's in a really good spot in terms of it's filling those vacancies, but obviously still has some recruitment challenges at the lower end. But what jumped out to me, and this is a little bit away from sort of the chapter and verse on warrants, but that we're going to want to be able to tell that story, because when you see these percentage changes in, say, the government category or the police category, you see a 2.5% levy, but then you see these sort of, high single digit and maybe 1 or 2, sort of double digit increases. I think for purposes of this budget period, it's going to be important to tell the story that we basically were running too much vacancy to really sustainably run the town. And what you're seeing is a look back to a prior period pre-pandemic where the town was sort of fully staffed. Maybe that's even, you're not going to show these necessarily because I think it's just too far back, but 19, 20, whenever we were sort of at a more near full employment, what you've seen over the last, 2 years is filling all these key roles, which when you look at the change, it looks like every department, or a lot of the departments that had that vacancy are now on a sequential basis in the last, let's say, 12 months or last budget period are increasing a lot higher. So I think we live it because we're in it and we see all the numbers, but I think we need to be able to articulate that story, both in terms of number, quantitatively and qualitatively, or have that sort of hand ready at the town meeting. Because if I were in there and I was, a townsperson that wasn't sitting through all these budget meetings and I was just sort of seeing the results, I would have that same question. It's like, it looks like all the administrative and sort of service functions in the towns are going up, and the COLAs and all these other negotiations, they all sort of came to a head in the last 12 to 18 months. So without that contextual framework, you're going to come to the conclusion that the town's overspending at the sort of government and sort of service level, and my taxes are going up. And someone may not connect the dots that way, but I think the numbers don't tell the story. You've got to be able to tell the stories about the numbers. That's just an observation from my own sort of chair.
And David, I think that's a great point. And we actually have up in front of us here, the general government, which is going up, 7.75%. So like, as you say, it's a big number, but I think to break out the story, it isn't incredibly difficult, because if you actually look at what's really driving it, most of the departments are going up within general government are going up fairly small. Land use, we're adding a full-timer because there seems to be a demand from the town that, we're supposed to be doing more around planning and master plans and conservation, all that. That's our biggest drive. That's, going up 45%, $42,000. IT is another one. It's going up about $48,000. I mean, we need servers. We need to change the way we do business, there.
Totally agreed.
You can tell that story fairly easily. If you look at the rest of them, the finance department, we're going up 1.85%. The, general town hall is going up 1%. Another big ticket item is the selectmen. They're literally going up 61% because we added 2 new select board members. So I
It's a
think
governance, right? Exactly. Yeah.
Hard.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
and for
think you
that,
just need to be able to, I think you just need to be able to tell that story, and it may be that simple, but I think the story is that, look, we had some deferred spending on technology, and technology spending comes in waves. You can only stretch your CapEx so long, right? And like you said, on the government, there's a lot of moving parts, but I just think it'll be important. Maybe no one will sort of ask that question, but I think, I think there's some jumps. Did police jump, Jeff? I thought police did. I just don't have my numbers right in front of me.
They are. I
yeah,
mean,
they're up, their weight, well, yeah, police are up by 5.5%.
yeah, I mean, and they're a big ticket item, right? They're up 5%, but they're also a $1.8 million.
One of the largest.
It's 100
So, yeah,
grand.
One of the largest.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for
one of the
sure.
largest subledgers. So and that's also too, and I think that's sort of the case everywhere. It's been hard for people to find. They've been supplementing with reserves, right? And so you need to hire a full-time person that's at a different benefit level, that's at a different price point. And that's a good thing when you can ultimately fill that role. That's the only thing that jumped out at me as I looked at the numbers in whole, is that if people are sort of focused on, hey, my taxes have been going up, a pretty high CAGR over the last 4 years, and these numbers look high, I just think we would be well served to sort of have a back pocket, either slide or discussion, to be able to just walk through it. And I think you probably could anyway right now, but it just felt to me like, hey, this is a time well spent.
Oh, for sure. That is absolutely part of the preparation before town meeting, is to go over those variances, play devil's advocate, think about what somebody at town meeting might want to draw a question to. We won't be able to anticipate the clockwinder questions, or the clockwinder stipend, but anything that we can reasonably anticipate, we want to have an explanation for, because, as you recall, at town meeting, there's going to be a reading by me. I think it was the chair last year, that went by expense category. So, reading the department and reading the budgeted request, and the folks that are at the annual meeting can call for a hold on any one of these line items. And so we'll go by and list moderator, select board, town administrator, finance and advisory committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all read, and people have the opportunity to, say, hold, I'd like to answer, or I'd like to ask a question about that.
And David, I would add, because I'm looking at the actual warrant booklet that got mailed out for last year, which, I will plan on being involved in this year, but that's another piece of media that you can use to get the word out on this. And so in looking at this, what we did last year, and sort of comparing to, say, how I did the one in Essex last year, the narrative piece from the finance committee that I pulled together for Essex had a lot more sort of little tables in it. And so it kind of highlighted some of these things you're talking about, and said, land use went from this to this, and then a comment section that sort of said, whatever the reasons are, or town clerk, town clerk's going up this big percentage, $30,000. It's a year with a presidential election. This is something that will come back down in a future year. It's every 4 years we go through the cycle.
Exactly.
So you can really, get ahead of a lot of these things, even within the booklet. And that also goes to, sort of Finn's elevator speech. The more we walk through these things, and the more we, put them to paper and talk them through and whatever, we all understand all these little parts and pieces a little bit better. But I think the booklet can go a long way to sort of pointing people in the directions you want them to go. You're never there's always going to be someone in the crowd who just has an axe to grind about whatever, the clerk's office, the finance office, whatever it might be, and you can't reach those people. But I think, through the booklet, and then when, Jeff reads it, I know when I had to read the article in Essex, you would go through these things, and you would highlight what you felt was, relevant to sort of say, I can see a few things are probably going to stick out to people. Let me take a minute and just walk through, you know, these 4 or 5 items to see if I can, you know, kind of give people a better understanding.
Yep, I totally agree. And a lot of that narrative that was in the individual presentations can lift and shift, and maybe you just refine the language to make it clear. But like a simple, not like a bridge, but give people the narrative bridge and maybe a table if there's been a lot of change in, you know, absolute head count, or there wasn't a position, there was a position created. I totally agree. And the more that you can do in the booklet, the easier you can control, because instead of going off script, you can say, hey, look, let's, you know, I'll refer you to this page on the you know, town warrants, and you can take a look here. Let me walk you through it. So I think that's a good approach. I'll finish up and then I'll let Finn go, but I'll say my overall observation was everything looked sort of reasonable, logical, defensible. I didn't see anything that like gave me a lot of heartburn. I know we've got a relatively de minimis amount to close the gap to get to sort of level funding, so that's not anticipated to be an issue. I think it's all in this sort of discussion narrative, and any other sort of loose items or things that get changed between now and then. But I didn't look at any one sort of department or item that really sort of caught my eye as being, you know, outside of what you would reasonably expect. And I think the departments are trying to live within the, you know, the parameters that they have. And I think one of the things we've got to try and explain is that the sort of Wenham experience, somehow bring the quantitative and the qualitative together to be able to explain, and maybe that's in the packet, maybe the opening of each department is, this department's responsible for delivering these services to the town. They are big picture, like 1 or 2 sentences. And then you can talk about the specific factors that relate to the budget for 25, the bridge or the explanation items. But it might be just good to lay down for people, you know, what we're delivering and what the town is delivering for services. Just to, because if you just come in with your own agenda item, which would probably be the case anyway with certain folks, you miss the big picture, which is you got to deliver the town through this budget.
Yep, good point. And I think we're moving, and with Steve and Jeff's help along that track and making some good headway. And at least we know that. I think you know, that now it's how to translate that for and present that for townspeople, so they can feel hopefully good about where their tax dollars are going. And it's being spent, you know, responsibly and wisely.
Yeah, so I want to, I just want to echo, you know, that we went through the really important stuff there at that meeting. Again, first one I've been to, but it went really well, and it ended honestly 4 hours earlier than I thought it was going to take to go through a whole town's budget. So there were a couple of things that stood out in my mind as I think back on it. You know, the first one was that, you know, if I understand the process right, you know, the education budget is still not finalized, and so we've kind of got an estimate number in our numbers, in the Wenham numbers, to figure out what it's going to be, and so you know, that being something like 60% of the town's budget. You know, though I am encouraged with the work we've done so far, and that the town, all the department heads have done thus far to kind of keep spending kind of under control. You know, that big portion of the budget could still swing, it seems, and we're going to have a completely different sort of narrative, both at hitting the override limit or not, and you know what the elevator pitch will end up being. You know, as one of the things that was pointed out at the meeting was that you know, historically the only kind of line item detail was salary and expense, right, and that the team is putting together, you know, more detail, you you know, with a new team in there, right, to give us more detail. I think that as that becomes available, I would encourage us being able to put that in the packet. You know, there was you know, that expense number is a big number often, and getting the breakdown will be pretty important to head off questions. The third, right, I think you guys have heard me mention this before as the fire department liaison. You know, they are kind of converting themselves. Their fire is kind of converting from a fire department to a life and rescue sort of service, right? So there was a lot of conversation about Gordon College not having to pay, but kind of elects to for the services the town provides, and it's kind of a question of how far can you push that reimbursement. There, you kind of heard between the chief and the deputy chief that it wasn't clear to me, you know, whether or not we really think that the stipend that they're providing us really covers the cost of services, but you know, we don't have a lot of rights to enforce it or push a higher number there.
Yeah, I've actually heard the fire chief say before that he would, it's his preference, given that Gordon College does not have to make any payment whatsoever as a university or a college. But the fact that they do is something that he doesn't want to rock the boat on. It would be his preference that the town not try to pursue the so-called pilot payments, because they're getting, in my impression from conversations with him, and maybe yours was different, that he feels like he's probably getting as much as he can get, and they're thankful for getting what they are, given it's not an obligation. It's at the college's discretion.
Right. Yeah, that was also my sense on it. So you heard that from the chief. He didn't feel like there was much wiggle room there. But you know, his deputy chief was saying, you know, gave an impression of, you know, that it may not be that we're really getting, if we were able to bill them, we would be billing them more. But wiggle room there. And the last thing that really stood out in my mind as I listened to the presentation was I started to stack up a lot of individually material expenses that will hit the town over the next 2 to 3 years. One of them was the conversation about potentially needing a second ambulance, and how would you budget for that, and where would the funds come from. The second was the finance team saying that the accounting system is likely going to need to change. I heard a number as high as $200,000, and that might be difficult to predict when that might be forced on us as opposed to something we can choose. The trash kind of bill going up by when that contract comes up in, I think, 2 years. And then the discussion about the school buildings, and that there's a bunch of different options for, you know, how big of a project but that's going to be. But those things all stack up to be some pretty big increases within the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, and laying
maybe.
on top of that as well, what's already been approved, which is the Fields project, that will initiate, I guess, sometime next year. So there'll actually be bonds issued to finance that, whatever that final number is. And you also heard Eric Mansfield talk about PFAS, which kind of came out of.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that one.
That
That was
wasn't
a
even
huge
part of-
number.
Yeah, that was $1 million from his estimation. That wasn't even in the discussion last year. Last year it was repainting the tanks at a cost of about $250,000, and now yeah, so this one's here as well. And I think you know, what we will do this year and what we did last year is do our best to give townspeople a look ahead. So there's not a surprise that they're not making a decision at town meeting on the FY25 budget requests and being completely ignorant about what's coming in 26, 27, and 28. Don't want the surprises. Want people to be forewarned and educated about what the next few years look like in terms of some of these larger capital projects.
I would definitely be interested in your opinion, guys, there in about your experience about bringing that stuff up at the town meeting or the town warrant, because it's not a discussion that has to happen to close our budget, and volunteering that, oh, in the next 3 years, here's $5 million more expenses that are coming our way, will give people a lot of reason to go onto that tangent, and spend the time discussing those. I definitely want to warn people, as I said, that numbers that we just kind of went through that list are not insignificant, but we could really derail the town meeting if we give time to discuss those.
I agree with you on that, Finn. And only, I think you want to give visibility, and maybe, I don't know if the annual report or something covers but things under evaluation over the next several years include the town fields project, the this, the that, because we don't know we don't have the details on the specific numbers and how they'll pencil out. Maybe there'll be a last minute grant. Maybe there'll be something we know that these are considerations that have to be dealt with, but we don't know the specifics. So maybe, I don't know, Jeff, you would probably know from your experience in Essex, if you give any forward, not guidance, but forward view of things coming down the pike. But I agree, we don't have the level of detail, except for maybe the field, to really, we don't want to start pro-forming future mill rates in the middle of the town meeting, because we wouldn't be really qualified to do it based on everything we know today. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, David, I would say, sort of to Finn's point, I mean, you don't want to be, disingenuous and say, I need you to pass this budget, so I'm not going to let you know what's coming down the pike. But you can talk about things in a high level. And so just to kind of walk through some things, so on the PFAS thing with the water. So first of all, it's in the water fund. So that really is going to come through water user fees, and it's not something that really rolls to the tax rate. Then, because that's an issue that's facing every community in the state, there's an agency called the Clean Water Trust that helps towns, deal with issues related to wastewater, septic, things like that. So it's highly likely that the town will get either some grant funds or will get some, they'll be able to bond through the Clean Water Trust at very competitive rates. I mean, I can tell you that Essex has loans to the Clean Water Trust for almost $30 million to build our sewer system. Those were loans at 0%. And in fact, not only were they 0% loans, they are actually forgiving some of the principal. So when problems of this nature hit, and they hit across the board, a lot of times something like the Clean Water Trust can help you sort of mitigate these problems. So, that would be an area where I'd say, yeah, let's not put the cart before the horse here. We don't even, I mean, Eric threw out $1 million the other day, but that might be supplemented by a few different things. It might, we might get some low interest rate bonds. It might not be nearly as big a problem as we think it is. Essex just went through the same thing in trash that Wenham is looking at, coming up here. It did end up being not as sort of catastrophic as we had thought it was going to be. It may not be that it's quite as bad. So I think you allude to these problems and let people know, because it builds credibility of we're not flying by the seat of our pants here. We are looking at, what's on the horizon, and,
Right.
and frankly, one of the things that becomes important is the kind of joint conversation between, Hamilton, Wenham, and actually the school. When Manchester and Essex were working together well, we did a really good job of sitting in a room and talking through, here's what Essex has for needs on the table, here's what the school has for needs, here's what Hamilton has for needs, and trying to sort of stagger things in a way where you could say, okay, so, Manchester has this issue on Pine Street they have to address. That's the big, like, between the three of us, we agree that's the issue that has to be addressed this year. And, maybe when Essex says, we'll deal with a couple of small things on our end this year, and then next year we'll deal with the school. But, there's a lot going on, and you'll have to stagger the, what schools get built and all that. So I think you sort of mitigate that one with good joint conversations. Getting back to Finn's thing about the accounting. Yep.
Jeff, just quick question on what you said. Do you usually document like some future considerations? Like, when I was writing annual reports for public companies, I would just put in, you put in something on, it would be like risk factors, but this would be really, here are some of the things coming up over the next couple of years. You got PFAS, we have the town fields. Is there any reason why we wouldn't just document that in the report as a general?
I think it ends up in a paragraph somewhere at a very high level.
Right.
I mean, you're not.
That's what I was thinking.
You're not completely quantifying it, because you don't, in a lot of levels, you really don't know you don't know when you're going to build the school, and you don't know what the interest rate's going to be, and you don't know how much SBA funding you're going to get. So you don't want to be putting out there, we're going to need a school and it's going to cost $50 million if we don't get any SBA funding.
Right.
So what about,
you're just identifying the topic area. That's
right. So if you couch this in terms of these are the decisions that the town is going to need to address in the next couple of years, right? And we encourage, I keep seeing that sign of we need people on committees, right? We encourage, citizens, to have a conversation with us in this coming year to help us make these decisions, right? And here are the ways that you can participate, and maybe take so that that tangent doesn't happen during the meeting, right? Instead is like, we really do want more citizen involvement. Here's how you do it, because we need help to decide what to do about PFAS and the town, the buildings and the grounds and all these other.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. Because you like, when you have really kind of tangible things that you can point out, you hope you're reaching that person who's, whatever, an environmental lawyer or somebody who's like, oh, I understand a lot about PFAS. Like, I could certainly get on a board, or I could do whatever. You might resonate with someone who, there's plenty of people I think who might want to get involved, but they're a little overwhelmed. But if you can kind of break things down into smaller bite-sized pieces, sometimes people can sort of say like, oh man, I could sit in on a committee to look at, how we're going to do trash or whatever. So I think you can absolutely, in a paragraph or two, lay that out in a way that it says, hey, we're looking at these things, and to your point, maybe actually, gets one or two people that actually say, I could help out with that. Or you get someone, this is how I got on the FinCom, is someone told my wife, like, your husband would be perfect for this. And the next thing I knew, I was on the FinCom. So, I think it can be helpful on a lot of fronts. And I think it's us being, forthright and letting people know, there are things coming down the pike, and we probably aren't going to deal with them all at one time, but just know we know they're all out there, and we're looking at ways to deal with them that are within, kind of the framework we have to deal with right now in terms of levy limits and people's tax rates and all that. And Finn, I just wanted to get back to, because I know I could tell that the accounting software thing kind of resonated with you the other day. The $200,000 that's kind of a one-time thing. There's a huge conversion cost that's $80,000 or $100,000 depending on who we might go with. At the end of the day, the real delta from year to year in terms of what we pay now and what we would pay for a new software, that's probably like maybe $30,000 to $50,000 in any given year. So it's not sort of a $200,000 hit, forever. And there are cheaper alternatives out there. I just did a conversion in Essex to a cheaper one. Quite frankly, I have a bit of buyer's remorse on it. It's got a little bit of a, you get what you pay for, but it was very manageable, and they managed to let us spread it out over 6 or 7 years. So we will have options, on that. So I just wanted to make it clear. It was, mainly that was a one-time kind of a thing for the big ticket, and then moving forward a little less.
Right. Well, the number is a lot smaller than my Oracle and SAP transitions that I've had to deal with. So, those are multi-million dollar
well,
transitions.
absolutely.
So this sounds a lot more manageable, but it sounds like we will try to push it off, but it may be 6 months from now we'll find out that we have to spend that money, and
They're
we'll
going
have
to
no
keep
choice.
doing it.
So
It's really just they're not improving it. I mean, they maintain it even right now at the bare minimum level. It gets the job done. It pays the bills. It writes the checks. It does all the stuff. But what they're doing, and you probably see it in your space. They got bought by another company, and basically the other company is putting all the bells and whistles into the new software, and they want you to change to that. And they just hope if they for long enough they say they won't add any new functionality or whatever, that you'll finally just cave and say, all right, I'll buy the better software. So we'll see. But yeah, again, I don't think it's imminent, like tomorrow we'll need new software. It will really be like how it will be on us, like how long we can just kind of deal with it not being an improving software. But it's not super imminent. And I did actually just get a call from Oracle the other day. I didn't even know that they were in this space, that they made municipal software, but I kind of giggled and thought, I can't even imagine how expensive an Oracle municipal software product would be.
yeah, that sounds like a trap. It's a trap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's about transparency, and my recollection from last year is that while not presented as this is what is going to happen, that Steve and Jamie at the time pulled together figures that did have some rough estimates. I think the thought process was that if you just talk generally about a PFAS purification system and a new school and the cost of fields and the trash contract expiring and going up in cost, without any estimates, general as they are, as to what those costs could be and what the impact could be. It might actually generate more questions because people
that's
then
what
they're going to say, all right,
I
well,
was
how much is
thinking
that
the
going to
same thing.
cost? How much is that going to cost? How much is that going to cost? Why didn't you tell me that it was going to cost that? So there's a balance, I think, of being forthcoming and getting people distracted.
Yeah, and I think you can say hand on heart, we know these are issues we have to deal with, so we should disclose that. But we should only disclose when it comes to numbers, things that we have a high level of confidence around, because each one of those conversations is a whole town meeting on themselves, right? And so I think if you have the level of specificity, then we can certainly provide it. But if we think that it's going to be partially grant funded and we feel like the number's squishy and a high level estimate, and if both the timing and the amount is indeterminate, then you wouldn't disclose it. You would do that for a public company.
And I think it's
right.
I think too, it's just in the introduction. It's certainly not a warrant article, so there is not the opportunity for people to speak to it directly. I think the moderator would redirect somebody back toward their seat if they got up and wanted to talk about something that wasn't part of the warrant.
Yeah, it'd definitely be outside.
And I think what's good about it, though, to talk about it is maybe when you're talking about the challenges that all municipals face. This is everybody across Massachusetts. Some of these issues cut across. You've got aging school systems. You've got water filtration systems that have to be upgraded. These aren't Wenham specific issues. They're faced by Essex and Hamilton and other towns too. So it could be a frame that just as part of the opening discussion, it's like, municipal budgets are there's a lot of, things that come up one time, and there's a lot of things that are always put pressure on the system. And these are the types of things. While there's a different availability of financing options and timing, these are some of the items that all of the communities in our geographic area are sort of facing over the next, couple of years, 3 years.
Yeah, good point.
aging
Yeah.
infrastructure.
We all approach
Yeah.
them differently. I think the schools are 60 years old, so that 60-year cycle is now turning toward Wenham.
Yeah, and
Right.
David, another thing too on that is that there will be, and this will be part of the capital discussion that's going to start in the next few weeks. You know, with some of the free cash, you know, Steve was talking today about, you know, allocating some money to stabilization, adding, you know, some money to, you know, sort of the equivalent of a bond sinking fund, adding, you know, adding
Yeah.
some money towards these problems that we just kind of walked through that are out on the horizon.
Absolutely.
To say, you know, we're trying to plan for that.
Yeah, we've
Yeah, it
collected
makes sense, and it
not gonna
also-
return them, so let's set it aside for you know, for good use.
Yeah, and especially if you know that the end of life on these things now, you're only going to be able to go so far, right? You might not have the cost completely stabbed, but you'll have it 80% correct. You'll get it directionally correct.
And I think too, as the budget is fine-tuned, that free cash number should be going down. Yeah, it shouldn't be 10%, right? It should be somewhere between
Yeah, but you know, and
4 and 8. Is that the
I
target?
mean, 4 and 6 is where
4
you're
and 6.
aiming. I mean, right now it's higher, but you know, so like right now, like if we were to sign off tomorrow, we could have just under $2.4 million of free cash certified for this year. And I think that's probably about the right number. Maybe there's a little bit more in there, but not, you know, hundreds, thousands more.
Which
and-
says that the budget is over need by more than 10%.
Well, it doesn't, because really, so we're looking at $2.4 million, but of that, 1.2 million of that is free cash from a prior period that is
Okay.
rolled forward.
Okay.
So really, you're generating about 1.2. So you're really not, you're kind of in where you should be in terms of what you're generating year over year
Mhm.
from operations.
Okay, so we
It's
just carried
the
quite a bit from
carryover,
last
which,
year.
you know, a lot of communities did this, where Essex did it, other communities did it, where you kind of, through COVID, you got more grant funds, and, you know, you spent less because, you know, you weren't fully staffing, you know, whatever, the library or other departments. So you were a little flush with cash for a year or two because of COVID. And most of us kind of sat on that money in free cash and said, you know, I mean, you think about back to 2020 or whatever, you really didn't know what was going on. So we all kind of sat on it. Essex sat on $1.2 million, $1.5 million, sort of very similar amount. And now that we're sort of coming out of COVID and, you know, we've got a little bit more certainty, everybody is sort of saying, okay, let's stop rolling over that big piece, you know, commit it to something, commit it to capital, commit it to stabilization. And, you know, so I think generally speaking, you know, there's not too many tweaks you're going to make to the budget, because you will begin to erode that free cash too. So what you can do, and I can't remember if I've suggested this to Jeff or maybe in a full meeting, but one of the things we had started in Essex was actually trimming the budgets a little bit based on, you know, sort of actual data, and saying, hey, you know, in, you know, FY23, you only spent X and you're asking for, you know, X plus 15% 2 years later. We want to cut that back. Now, if we cut it back, we're potentially digging into free cash. So what we did is we actually said, you know what, we're going to cut that $5,000 out of that line item. We're actually going to add that to the finance committee reserve. So it still stays in the budget. It could still roll to free cash, but we've now sort of right-sized that budget a little bit. So, you know, that might be something that we might look at. You know, and I have a spreadsheet up here that I'll show Jeff, but I'll roll out to everybody. But it is sort of what we talked about the other day. It's got actuals from, you know, FY21, 22, 3. And then it has a column to even show you, you know, what have we spent year to date in 24? How does that project out? And then just gives you a lot of real-time data. You know, how are you comparing to FY23 actual spending? You know, if you're up, you know, 15% over what you really spent in FY23, maybe that's an issue. To David's point earlier, well, maybe, you know, maybe it's not, because maybe 23 was, you know, you weren't fully staffed, or maybe there were some, you know, reasons that 23 is kind of low. But we can sort of, you know, the spreadsheet allows you to identify those things, and from there you take that and have conversations. But, you know, the idea would be it's going to give folks a better, you know, kind of real-time appreciation of the budget, and, you know, maybe streamline some of our discussions. So we've been pumping data into it for, you know, the last day or so. And hopefully I'll have that to kind of roll out to you guys, you know, next week. And it's a, you know, I find it to be a pretty interactive tool, pretty easy to use. But, you know, I'm open to any suggestions you guys have. But what I like about it is it's one spreadsheet. All the budgets are in it. There's no opening the police salaries spreadsheet and then opening the DPW expense spreadsheet. It's all in one place, and you just click from tab to tab, and it all rolls into one number. And you can, what's really nice is you can kind of see how it rolls into ultimately what we expect the tax rate to be and that type of thing. And we try to show you, what makes up the levy limit, what makes up the local receipts, what makes up, other sources of revenue, quantify the capital, what's going to fund the capital, free cash, debt, that sort of thing. So, I'm hopeful that, you'll have that in your hands next week, and hopefully that'll be a good tool for you.
I like that idea, Jeff, because it holds departments accountable for their budget, basically their actual budget to their forecast, right? And then you do have this other amount where you have the money, but at the end of the year, when you get into intercompany transfers, you won't have to go back necessarily to the free cash flow. In theory, this all flows into the free cash, but you could go to this account if someone was under by 1,000 or something, but it was still within their forecast. But it seems like it's a much more sophisticated way to budget a department for some of the variable expenses, right? Not salaries.
To me, it allows
Yeah.
it feels like it allows the town to have a little more judgment about
Exactly.
some spending is taking place rather than at the department level. So you take that excess that each department has built into their budget, which they wanted discretion on how to spend, pull it to a higher level and think about whether there's a greater good for that money than what that department head thinks that money should be used for.
Yeah, and that's the idea. Ultimately, like your committee is the arbiter of that, right? I mean, if someone is going over, they have to come to the finance committee and say, we need $5,000 from the reserve fund, and here's why. And there are specific rules around, a reserve fund transfer according to Mass General Law is only for unforeseen, unexpected, sort of things. And so they can't come to you and say, we just thought it'd be nice if we added another staff person. Like, it has to be, just to like simplify it, like the DPW comes to you and says, so even a storm like the other night, we had to close Larches Row because, there were, 100 trees down or whatever. We can't plan for that kind of storm. We need an extra 5,000, and everybody, that makes sense to everybody, and you allocate it. But it makes it so people are less likely to come to you with sort of what, I always call it the wants versus needs. They can't come to you for a finance committee reserve transfer for a want. It has to be a need. It has to be, Eric comes to you and says, this new PFAS regulation hit sooner than we thought. I need $15,000 to, address this issue in real time. But if they don't come to you and that money sits there, as Jeff says, then it returns it to the town. There's a higher likelihood it returns to the town in the form of free cash. And then you get to decide whether that's capital stabilization or whatever.
For the greater good. That's all great feedback, guys. And I think where we kind of are now in thinking, or I am now in thinking about our meetings for the next at least few weeks until the availability of the capital budget will certainly generate some more questions and some more requests for time with department or committee heads. But anything jump out to any of you as areas where, based on Saturday's discussion, we should be thinking about inviting somebody back in? Needing a little more detail, a little greater understanding of something that was discussed, maybe at a high level, didn't want to drill down into the detail in the forum of having both finance committee and select board here. Yeah, I've gone through the budget and made a bunch of notes where I think I'd be interested in more information. All with the thought in mind of being as prepared as possible for annual town meeting and where questions might come from. But want to get your input as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have some notes as well. I didn't see. I mean, I'm not the liaison for the school budget. That seems like the biggest, obviously the biggest number by far. But that I wouldn't mind. I don't know if we could do anything there, but I think Jeff, you sort of have that one. So if you feel comfortable, I sort of defer a little bit to you. But I would. That one's such a large one, but that gets done on a much more formalized basis because there's so many intersection points and it's an appropriation and allocation process. But that's the one that I probably feel I personally, and maybe I just need to spend time with you to understand what the real variables have been in the budget process for this year. And because
Sure.
it's a shared responsibility, I just feel like that's the big sort of giant one in the room. I could get my hands around the library and the council, and I have a list of questions I'll go through. I didn't see any department where I go, geez, there's some things questions I'd ask, but I don't think I'd need them to represent their business. But I would definitely, maybe we collate our questions, or at our next meeting, we go through each department and collectively aggregate our questions and let the liaison be the point person to bring those back and try and get any items we need if it's not just financial. Just a thought.
Yeah, could do that. I think in the past we've had the department head come back so that everybody hears the information at the same time, rather than it being filtered through the liaison. And specifically about the schools, there is an all members meeting on the calendar for January 30th with the second of the all member quintuple board meetings with the school. So that's January 30th. And there is another chairs only meeting with the schools on January 10th. And that is all, I think the January 10th meeting will come right around or just after when we should get a finer view of just what they're going to come in at. Whereas right now our share of the increase is 3.41. We've got it targeted in our budget at 2.9. The superintendent of schools has been signaling that he'll get his number below 3, so we should be in good shape. But I think we actually learned that in early January. And then just to recall that with the schools, it's a kind of an up or down. We don't get to dig into the details. Well, I guess we can ask questions, but it's a different format than we have for reviewing town government numbers, where we can and do look at them individually by department. School is a more general review.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, generally speaking, what Jeff says is right. And so the school sort of, they put a lot of time and effort into the budget process. I mean, obviously they're, really bigger than either of the two towns. It's a lot to manage. And so they prefer not to have extra time taken away from them to come in and meet specifically with Hamilton or specifically with Wenham. They sort of like to set the schedule so that there's some of these smaller ad hoc, like chair meetings or meeting with, maybe the town administrators from both towns and the superintendent and the finance director over at the school. So, the relationship with the school tends to work best when you operate within the framework of, we have these, whatever, 2, 3, 4 all board meetings. We have these, smaller ad hoc meetings. I don't know these folks well, obviously I haven't been here that long, but I know, the schools can tend to resent, if they feel like they keep getting called into one of the two communities to kind of do a dog and pony show and sort of sing for their supper in the Manchester Essex district. That's happened on both sides. There's been times when, they felt like they had to go to Manchester every other week. And there's been times, now where they feel like they have to come to Essex more frequently. And I think there's a general feeling of it's just a waste of you know, the school committee and all the parties involved of their time. So to the best you can, I think you try not to call them in for specific meetings with just the FinCom. But, you know, that being said, it doesn't say you can never do it. But, you know, in my experience, everything works better when we kind of sort of stick to this framework that we have in place right now with the board, you know, all board meetings. You know, and you do have, I mean, Steve is in contact with these people quite a bit. So there is always the, you know, the opportunity to either tell me or tell Jeff or, you know, Steve, you know, this is really, I got one or two issues that are really concerning me. Like, can you get me some, you know, just some more detail on this? I think that can work effectively as well.
Yeah, so bubble up any questions that you have specifically about the school budget, and yeah, I will do my best at the next chairs meeting to air that question. But I would say that, you know, generally my impression is that they are running about as tight as they can, and they have a number, just as the town has different unions that they need to negotiate with. The schools have multiple unions that they need to negotiate with, and apparently at least a few of the union contracts are currently in process of being renegotiated. And the job action that took place with the teachers' strike in Andover has really emboldened the Mass Teachers Association. Their expectations are beyond reasonable in terms of what they think every community ought to be able to absorb in the way of increases for their members, even though the circumstances in Andover probably very different than the circumstances here in Hamilton and Wenham. But you know, they get a win, like UAW got a win with one automaker, and now they want to use that for each of them. That win that the teachers union got in Andover apparently is putting a lot of pressure on the negotiations that the school has to go through right now for the various unions that they have to work with. And I think there's also a new union that they will be negotiating with for the first time for teaching assistants. So just a bit of a backdrop of, it's not unique. I guess everybody's going through it. Towns are going through it, but the schools are certainly going through it as well. So it's, but again, yeah, happy to bubble up questions, because I do get the opportunity at these chairs meetings, and I can tell you that what I have been advocating for, and the chair of the FinCom in Hamilton have been advocating for, and this started last year, is similar to what's been the process that's adopted here in Wenham, of describing more or developing some metrics and some measures that somebody might be able to look at the spending in the school and translate that into how does it compare to peer groups, and also whether the spending in the schools could be viewed as being efficient and effective. And I think we're going to be making some progress. It's something that the schools, I think he's the assistant superintendent, the finance guy over there, Vinny, has described the difficulty apparently in making peer-to-peer comparisons, something about the challenge of a dual town school system. But it is something that we've, at each of the first two chair meetings, been asking about. And I did see a bit of a preview before the all members quintuple meeting that we had a few weeks ago. But Vinny said he wasn't ready to share that yet. But he does seem to be working diligently. So, yeah, I think I'd just close on and talking about the schools as saying they're listening. I think they're receptive. I think there maybe has been an expectation in the past that the people that show up at town meeting are supportive of the school. But we've been encouraging the school system and the superintendent to try to improve their marketing of their request, similar to what we're proposing here in town, rather than simply following the process in the past.
Jeff, do you have any insight you can provide for me? I keep looking at the town calendar to make sure that I've got everything planned for the next couple of weeks and that sort of stuff. I'm not going to be missing any meetings. You are confident about these dates for particular meetings happening, in January and all that sort of stuff. But there's never data. There's never stuff scheduled more than a week or so ahead on the town calendar. Is there some sort of like requirement for the agenda to be set before that can be posted there?
Yes, yeah. In order to post a meeting, you need an agenda. But what I am working on, and you might recall, we did this a couple of months ago. I put out a calendar of looking actually right out to April and town meeting of the meetings for FinCom that either have been planned because they're joint meetings or with select board or ones which I've added to the calendar myself to support our effort here in reviewing the budget and getting to all the votes that we need to and hitting the dates for the warrant book and all those things. Steve was looking at the calendar yesterday with the select board. He shared a copy of that with me today, and I went through it and added the meetings that I had kind of penciled in a couple of months ago and had planned to, after tonight's discussion, redistribute that. So you all would, again, have a pretty good look forward of when I think that FinCom will meet from now until the beginning of April at town meeting.
Yeah, the one that you sent a couple months ago, I've populated my calendar with it, and so I really do appreciate that insight with the amount of heads up you've given us all, so that we can plan on being present for all these things. I was just confused, why when we know what the schedule is going to be, it's not published publicly, since it's supposed to be publicly available for people to attend.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. And those dates are moving around a little bit, frankly, based on what the select board has had to shift or just a few changes in the deliverable. So it will be important for me to get a new calendar out, because the one that I just got today does have some changes from the one that I had shared with you guys. The changes are, maybe it's a week forward, maybe it's a week back from when it was, but maybe Jeff can talk more to your specific question about why you can't look and at March and see FinCom meetings already scheduled.
Yeah, I mean, so really, Finn, over the last several years, there's been more and more changes to the open meeting law, which, it deals with a lot of things. It deals with, the meeting minutes, it deals with posting, agendas and all these different things. So typically what, we see happen is folks don't just sort of put out there like, look, the FinCom's going to meet every second, every other Wednesday, and just, throw something in the calendar, for the next 3 months, because the requirement is to like sort of have the clerk post the meeting, you have to have an agenda. There's a whole, process you have to go through. The agenda has to, be done in the right way, and the clerk signs off on it. So, I would say typically, as a, finance committee member in Essex, I might have every other Wednesday in my personal, iPhone. But the meetings will hit basically like a week beforehand in terms of the actual town calendar. And it's really just a function of, because of the open meeting laws, you don't want to get caught where you're like, oh God, that meeting for January 3rd, it was sitting in the calendar and we totally forgot to get the agenda posted, within 48 hours of the meeting. So now we actually have to cancel.
Cancel the meeting.
And that can happen, it does, and it's, it's a little bit of egg on your face and whatever. So I think that's kind of the reasoning is if you don't post it, if you don't post them in advance, you don't end up missing, the agenda or whatever. So my suggestion would just be like, I'll pop all of these that Jeff is, putting in front of us into my own personal calendar. But they won't hit, until likely, 3 or 4 days before the actual meeting on the town calendar.
And it's possible that some of these that I have identified in this calendar that I've shared with Jeff and I'll share with the finance committee again, won't happen. Yeah, I've tried to build in maybe more meetings than are required, just so we don't have to scramble and put some meetings into the calendar in order to stay on track with our review of budget and our votes on recommendations. So I'd say that what's on the calendar is the most we will need to meet as opposed to the bare minimum.
Okay, thanks guys very much for your insight on that.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's nothing specific. Maybe give you guys, and then certainly want to hear from Scott and Dano as well about whether and whom we invite back in to answer some additional questions, or if collectively the group thinks it's better just to let the liaisons go off and have those discussions. So
Jeff, one of the things that stood out in my mind as I think about the elevator pitch, right? The conversations, the directive that all the departments had was basically level funding, and the only place where there's material increase is across the board is where there were employment contracts, right? Union contracts. And that's going to hit in lots of places. We talked about it being the largest that we saw in the police union, right? But it's hitting all these. And I think about what my elevator pitch is. All right, we increased, there was an increase in the total budget of the town of X, thousands of dollars, and 50% of that, or some number that's pretty significant, is coming from these union contracts. And there were 4 of them, right? I don't know enough about how that negotiation goes to know whether it was I think it was done by town representatives. It wasn't done at a state level, right?
right.
And so that process to negotiate that, it's fraught, like you said, with the Andover school system. As to, it's hard for me to judge. It seems like most of those numbers were kept to 3% in most cases, which seems very reasonable considering the last couple of years of 8% inflation. But that's going to be the biggest line item, right? If I think of like the biggest thing that I can put a bracket around and say, half of our town expense increase is coming from these employment contracts. So to understand maybe a little more information about like how well to do, or
You're breaking up a little bit, but yeah, I agree 100%. And that's where some of my follow-up questions lie. Police, for instance,
Towns or something
uh,
like that.
yeah, police, for instance, reported a 6% increase on the salary and wages line. And we did get some information on Saturday about uh, those increases, and that maybe they were front loaded a bit. Didn't want to bog us down, given that we were expected to move through a lot of folks and a lot of pages in 3.5 hours into what those were specifically for the library, for fire, for police. But yeah, I think it would be prudent for
I think
us to get that information to understand better just what that looks like. Why is it 6% this year? What's it going to look like next year? Get more data there.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Jeff. I would do a dive and just on the contract area, say, okay, we had 4 contracts or whatever the number is renegotiated during, this calendar year that will impact budget year 25. Here's the basic parameters of them. These were sort of whatever the percentage and associated sort of items are. The police one was more complex because you also have a sort of employee mix shift issue in that contract, because the lower employees get higher step increases for the first 3 years and the seniors don't, and they're hiring more at the junior level. So we don't have to get into that level of forensic data with the town unless someone wants to get into it. But I think it's important. That's like a topic area where we could bring, we could probably get the information readily from you, Jeff. But I think that's an important one. I think to Finn's point, it's such a big mover on our salary expense side, which is got to be our biggest expense item outside, when you obviously when you factor the school, but even outside of the school. I think that's a, collective bargaining agreement negotiations always sort of have big expense line implications.
Yeah.
Why don't we do I'm sorry.
I just want to say, I thought Finn actually kind of framed it really well in terms of, and just so you understand, it's not just the actual the collectively bargained contracts. There's also an assumed 2% COLA for, regular non-union employees, so my finance group or, Steve's office or whatever, there's a 2% COLA for regular employees. And then, if we're looking at overall, it's really about a 3% increase to wages. And one subset is really only at 2%. In the greater context, I mean, we've talked about Andover and that school, the school negotiations there and how that has a trickle down effect everywhere. The police is also another, that's another big union in this state. And so you are also, dealing with that, union negotiation in that context. And so I think, you can frame the discussion certainly to some degree that if you look at it relative to what's happening in other places, this is actually, we're in a fairly good position. And with the police, one thing that, is sort of another variable in this mix is because of police reform, and we heard a little bit about this on Saturday, most departments, it's getting harder and harder to find reserves because the requirements to be a reserve are essentially becoming the same as being a full-time police officer. And so at some point, if you're qualified to be a full-time police officer, you're going to go do that in Peabody rather than being a part-timer in Wenham. So it's placing challenges on departments and it's placing challenges on smaller departments more so than the larger, cities around us, because there's less upward mobility and things like that in a small department like Wenham or like Essex. So you almost have to be a little bit more competitive, or at least as competitive as, say, a Beverly, because if someone leaves Wenham and goes to Beverly, they've got a much better chance of becoming a sergeant or becoming a lieutenant or, whatever, moving up the ranks versus, here, you've got a chief, a deputy, 2 or 3 sergeants, I think, something like that. You don't have a lot of as much upward mobility. And so because the reserves are kind of, stopping to exist, you're going to need to, make your contracts more competitive, which is where you get things like we're adding, kind of the steps, that's sort of more like the school contracts, right? If I don't know how many of you are familiar with the school contract, but it's the concept of the step and scale. You get your salary raises, for each year you're here, that's another step. And then the scale is, do you have a master's degree? Do you have a master's plus 30? Do you have a, so the police contracts are more and more starting to mimic, you know, those school contracts. And so while it's a big increase on our, you know, sort of, you know, expense line, I think to stay competitive in the marketplace to, you know, to get these officers and steal them from somewhere else, you know, you have to do it. And again, to put it in the, you know, context of Essex, you know, we're paying more than Essex, but that's one of the reasons we have more reserve officers, because the folks that are hanging on and staying on as reserves are going to do it here for $1 or $2 more an hour than they're going to do it for in Essex. So there's a bigger context, and certainly like Steve is probably the best person to have these discussions with. You know, and I will say the other issue, you know, around sort of these contractual negotiations and things is, you know, there's been, as we've discussed, you know, probably in a bunch of meetings, there's been an awful lot of turnover here in Wenham over the last, whatever, 5 or 6 years. And that has led to some sort of choppiness with some of these, you know, union negotiations and relations with the unions and things like that. So I think we are also in a period of kind of, you know, getting these things set and back on track. And unfortunately, it's sort of in, you know, kind of a bad environment to be doing it. But overall, back to Finn's point, you know, I think if you look at it sort of relative to the inflationary world we live in, you know, it's certainly not. So I think we can, you know, frame it that way.
So try to kind of move forward here and think about what is the best next date to meet and what to cover as an agenda. Jeff, maybe you can give us an idea of when we might see capital.
So capital is, I mean, he just sent out everything to the sort of the department heads. He's already met with department heads and has a sort of starting point on capital. Now what he's doing is sort of finalizing, you know, okay, I know what you need, you know, show me pictures of, you know, your facility, you know, show me the rugs, the whatever that need to be replaced. And so they're going to be discussing it at the select board level on the 16th of January. You know, Steve and I will probably be meeting with departments, you know, ahead of that, you know, obviously over the next few weeks. But when I look at the schedule and I think about sort of the idea of calling some departments back, you know, calling them back after the 16th of January when we have a finalized kind of capital budget probably makes a lot of sense, because, you know, as we said earlier, there aren't really a whole lot of questions around the operating budgets that have been presented because they were essentially level funded except for sort of contractual COLA. You're more likely to have questions that arise out of some capital budgets and, you know, trying to get a sense of, you know, that need. I haven't really gone through the process here yet. I know like in Essex, we had folks fill something out that really tried to prioritize things, you know, over a 5-year schedule. When do you need this? And what's the priority? You've got, you know, 5 things on your list for, you know, FY25, rank them, which one, you know, which is the most important, what's the least important. I assume we do something similar, but it would seem that like if we're potentially have a meeting on the 17th, that would be a good time to start getting folks back in, because you would have not only any lingering operating questions you might have, but you would probably have some capital questions at that point. And it would also be, you know, again, the big departments, you know, it's you know, you know, my department is not going to have lots of capital requests or anything, but the police, the DPW, the library are likely to have, you know, some bigger ticket items. The fire department, I know, has a few big capital items that are on there that need to be addressed. That would seem to be, you know, the 17th, the 21st, 17th, 24th, and 31st of January, probably good dates to get folks back in here to have some deeper dives.
Yes, I may not want to leave it quite that long, because by this calendar, we're expected to have made our taken our final votes on recommendations, but for every department on the 31st.
Yeah.
So that might push off a lot of work a little too late, but
so if you've got some,
but fair, you know, fair
capital,
point.
you could
we can start ticking those off. Yeah, and if we want to know more about the labor contracts, But it sounds like a meeting next week probably is not going to be needed, so I think I'll just take that one out of the calendar. That has our next meeting then scheduled for January 3rd. That is the day after the select board opens the warrant. And that is 1 week before the next school committee all chairs meeting. So if there are questions that you all would like me to share and bring up with the school superintendent and his finance guide, then that January 3rd meeting would probably be a good time to get that information, because I would have that meeting on the 10th of January. So why don't we do that, guys? It's getting close to 8:30. I'm going to get a revised calendar out. I'm going to cancel meeting next week. I guess I'll reach out individually to Scott and to Dano to see what their thoughts are on follow-up discussions. Definitely, I think we want to get a better understanding of these union contracts, which, as you've said, labor is a big part of these budgets, and where they are going up more than the amount that we can increase our tax levy, then they are slowly eating into the rest of the operating budget. So it'd be useful to have more data there, and I'll go through the other questions that I raised, and Dave and Finn, if you do as well, that I think that'll help inform which departments it would make sense to have back before we get the information about the capital plan or capital budget, and then we can fill in if we need to do that once we do have that capital spending information.
So Jeff, do you want us to email you any questions we have by department? What do you want or do you want us to just bring it to the next meeting? What would you prefer?
I'm not sure how much we should be doing outside meetings. Again, given the rules around open meeting laws.
Yeah, you can individually. So David individually to Jeff,
But
and
not copy the rest
not
of the
everybody,
FinCom.
And copy me or whatever. Individually you can reach out to the chair. You just don't want to end up with those, email conversations that involve, more than two of you. Or whatever. But yeah, I can't hurt to send those in, because then, whether it's Jeff or it's me, we can start to maybe find some answers to those, internally here at town hall, or whatever, to kind of keep things moving rather than waiting until the next meeting to get them out there on the table.
Yeah, and I'll
Like
do
that.
whatever you guys want.
Yeah, no, I like that idea.
The best practice. Okay.
Yeah, I like that idea. That I think allows the meetings to be as productive as possible, because we've maybe been able to circulate or socialize the questions ahead of time. And we can talk about, rather than just talking about the questions, maybe we'll be talking about some of the responses.
Yes, yeah.
And
And we all hear different things in we all hear different things in meetings. Maybe it was answered, you know what I mean? Some of it may be, oh yeah, that was it, but some of it might be, another question to someone else in the town hall.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, good. So, listen, great. Have a great holiday, guys. We are not going to meet 2 days after Christmas, and we will get together again at the beginning of January. But as we were just saying, any thoughts come up about follow-up meetings, pointed or questions directed toward schools or any other departments, just bubble those up and we'll work to get them answered.
Sounds
Okay,
great.
thank
Will
you.
do.
With that, take a motion, entertain a motion to adjourn our meeting. Somebody would like to make that motion,
This is Finn. I'll make that motion.
and a second.
David Harnish, I will second.
All in favor of adjourning the meeting of the Wenham FinCom at 8:27. All in favor, Jeff Calder, yes.
Finn Sprague, yes.
David Harnish, yes.
Safe travel, guys. Thank you.